Well, thank you, Max. Really happy to be here. And I think, as we just heard, we just saw a great video there. I think Kaya's video and Eric's did a really good job of sort of communicating carbon pricing to the average person, which I think is really sorely needed. We see a lot of movement, but we need more of that. So I'm just here to I might repeat a bit what she said, but I think it's important to reemphasize some key points about carbon pricing. So I'm going to talk to you, what is it? Why do we need it? Why it's a good idea? Who is using carbon pricing now, and what's next to scale that up to achieve what we really need to do with climate change globally. So first, what is carbon pricing? Okay, this is a key concept that essentially right now we are driven by a fossil-based economy that does not capture the costs of that economy. So those are costs in the form of health impacts or environmental impacts. Those are costs in the form of traffic congestion in the cities we live in. And there are costs in the form of extreme weather events that we're seeing more and more of, where the vulnerable and the poorest are seeing they're paying those costs in their livelihoods. So how do you address that? You have to put a price on carbon pollution. Putting a price on carbon pollution is a very elegant, simple solution, and it really does two things. One is it achieves that environmental target, but secondly, it generates money. This is a pool of money, a pot of money, if you will, that can then be used for that political discussion about how do we make this transition happen globally. This is really important because in many cases there are winners and losers, and so we have to see what is this money going to do to help us make that shift. So whether you use a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, carbon pricing provides sort of this triple dividend. It provides this pot of money. It does it in a very efficient way. And instead of acting alone, it provides more efficiency. We've seen some studies we did recently that carbon pricing markets would be 25% more efficient to achieve the Paris Agreement outcome. And that is saving us trillions of dollars in 2050 in achieving the Paris outcome. So that's a very important benefit. But carbon pricing revenues can be used, as I said, to accelerate this conversation. So it can drive innovation, and it can cause you to change your behavior. So whether it's the consumer that finally decides, you know, I need to put insulation on my house, and I want to have a warmer, safer house, but it's also going to save money. It could be the UPS or FedEx deciding, I'm going to replace my vehicle fleet with electric vehicles because now it's becoming too costly to use. Carbon pricing is making it too costly to operate a fleet that's powered on gasoline. Or it could be a big cement plant or a big industrial facility saying, I need to be much more efficient. So this is going to drive innovation. It's going to drive the investment in new solutions, new business models. And we're seeing already around the world, you can see here who's using carbon pricing. So right now we have over 60 jurisdictions that use a carbon price in some way. This is about 40 national and 20 plus subnational. A lot of leadership at the subnational level, including the Canadian provinces, California, the Northeast states, and the US. So they're all putting a price on carbon. That's about 12% of global emissions are currently covered with a price of some kind. And then China is currently working on a national carbon pricing scheme that when that goes into place next year, we will double that coverage. So it will be 25% of global emissions will have a price of some sort. In addition, what do Microsoft, Disney, and ExxonMobil have in common? All three of these companies use an internal carbon price to factor in their investment decisions. So what they're doing is essentially factoring in a price on carbon ranging from $10 to $80 a ton into their investment decisions. They tell us, why are they doing this? Well, they're sort of future-proofing their business model. They see this government momentum on carbon pricing, and they want to be ready for those prices now and beat their competitors out and find new product lines and find new ways to innovate. So this sort of business support, we're seeing it grow very much. So those are all great stories, right? We've got 60-plus jurisdictions pricing carbon. We've got, I think it's over 1,000 businesses using an internal carbon price. That's great momentum, but we're not there yet. So that's 12% of coverage. We need to have really every major economy should be pricing carbon in some way. This is a great solution that most governments have indicated as part of their Paris plans that they will use, but we need to move forward with that. And the key thing is that the average price level of pricing the carbon pricing today is about $10 a ton. So that's much lower than most economists will say to really drive that investment decision, to make them shift into renewables or to invest more in efficiency. It's a signal, but it's not high enough. So in order to try to drive this ambition and action, we launched the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition last year at the Paris COP. You can see here all the different members. We have 180 plus members in the coalition, including governments, business, and civil society working together. They have a collective mission to accelerate the use of carbon pricing to the point when we have an effective global carbon price. So all of them are working together. We've, as the World Bank, facilitate this discussion. And what we're trying to do is really capture best practices in addressing. Every jurisdiction faces a very tough political decision around carbon pricing. They're going to hear that it's going to hurt competitiveness. They're going to hear that jobs will move overseas. They'll hear that energy prices might be higher for the poor. And so we have to crack those issues. Every single jurisdiction has to address those challenges. And so by bringing together the best knowledge of all the people that are doing carbon pricing, and by trying to facilitate dialogues around this, how do you solve this problem, we can really tackle that challenge. And so we have put out a set of principles around fairness and equity. I think a key question we see here now is how do you shift people that are affected in the fossil fuel industry into the greener technologies we want to see? Can you use carbon pricing revenues to do that? How do we ensure that carbon pricing is aligned with other policies like fossil fuel subsidies? We need to remove fossil fuel subsidies. That's another key element to this. And how do we ensure ultimately this is very efficient and it is delivering on the environmental outcome we hope? So that is the coalition. I think finally, my final point to you is we need all of you to join us and help. We need to start to tell more of the story like Kaya did so well in her video and some other work we're hoping to do about it isn't just a carbon pricing a means of itself, it's carbon pricing equals more solar energy. Carbon pricing equals more energy efficiency. Carbon pricing equals we're going to save the coral reefs. I mean, this is sort of the visions we want to give people is that this is a great tool that will achieve this environmental outcome. And we need all of you to join us and out there to give these stories, bring stories to life around the benefits you can get from really being a leader in carbon pricing. So join us, and we look forward to working with you in the Carbon Pricing Coalition. Thank you. I have time for a few questions, and I'm happy to answer that one too if there's none.
So maybe we can get started with. Hi. So maybe we can get started with that question, which was, how can you deal with carbon pricing in terms of trade policy and the cross-border issues?
Right. I was just moderating a panel upstairs of a lot of lawyers looking at this issue, so this came up as well. So the easiest way is under the Paris Agreement, Article 6 allows for the trading of emissions. There's actually a new UN term called the ITMO, the Internationally Traded Mitigation Outcome. And this allows parties to voluntarily trade to achieve their different emissions targets. And so you can see, we talked upstairs with attorneys seeing sort of carbon clubs start to form, and they would be kind of a safe haven. So we're all going to trade and link our systems, and so there are no trade issues because we're going to agree in a sort of a smaller group that this is a safe haven, and this is the most efficient way for us to do this. I think there are, you probably heard discussions during Marrakesh and others around sort of applying a border carbon tax. If I price carbon and you don't, then any of your products that come in, we're going to slap a tariff on them. I mean, that's sort of a more threatening thing that might be out there in terms of a tactic. I don't know how realistic that is and WTO law and all of that. I think the more likely scenario is going to be this sort of bottom-up formation of clubs. We're already seeing an MOU was established between Mexico, some Canadian provinces, and California recently to explore this sort of linking. Because right now we do see a linking between California, Quebec, and Ontario provinces. So you're seeing subnational leadership. They've agreed to the terms by which they can trade carbon. So that's the kind of way I think you'd address those trade issues.
Do we have any more questions in the crowd? Francis.
My one concern with carbon pricing is that in order to, you said you wanted to drive change to more renewable energy sources, but if you're not giving then subsidies to help promote that these types of energies, you can also end up hurting the consumer and also those companies, because if you're just forcing these prices on them without helping to create the change, it can end up just hurting others. So what are also the plans to deal with, maybe give subsidies or give help for these renewable energy sources to really go along with this?
Yeah, I think that's a good point is that carbon pricing is not a silver bullet. It's not going to answer every single climate problem. It's a key sort of cornerstone policy, but you do need to have targeted support for key technologies. But I would there break it into different types of technologies. So there are technologies like solar PV and wind in a lot of parts of the world are actually cost competitive with natural gas or coal. And so you don't really need to subsidize them any further. It's just a matter of, in emerging markets, getting them comfortable with the new technology, and that's the kind of thing that the World Bank Group can do. But I would go to the next generation technologies like energy storage, the smart grid. Some of those are going to cost a little bit more than the existing grid and the existing fossil infrastructure, and so you do have to make sure you don't say, we're only doing a carbon price, sorry, there's no research and development support, or there's no demonstration money for this. I think governments are, the interesting thing, going back to my point about using the revenues, though, is we just heard upstairs that Quebec province has already generated $1 billion in revenue from its carbon market, and it's pumping that back into light rail, electrification of vehicles, and that sort of thing. And I think that's how you can get, you're using that money to subsidize the technologies you want to see.
So maybe one final question, if there's still one out there. Otherwise, I think I'm going to thank you very much, Tom. Sure. Fantastic having you here.
Thank you.